Equipped as we are now with all of those skills for using constraint layouts, actually building this layout is going to be quite straightforward. Remember, the toolbar at the top of the screen, that is taken care of for us by our theme, so we don't need to manually add a toolbar, although do note it is possible to do this if you want to. So all we really need on our screen is the bottom navigation bar, this bottom navigation view we're going to add in just a moment, and then the container where our fragment will live. Okay? We want the bottom navigation bar pinned to the bottom of the screen, but filling the width, and then we want the container where our fragment will go, filling the remaining space between the bottom bar and the top of the screen. And everything that we've learned in the previous 3 tutorials will help us do this. So as mentioned, in Android, the view that we need to provide our bottom navigation bar is called a capital B bottom navigation view with a V. You can go ahead and autocomplete that. We could do match parent, but let's do best practice. Let's do 0 dp for the width. Let's pin it to the start and the end of the screen. But the height, we can do wrap content. Then we'll do a self-closing tag. So let's go ahead now and add the constraints that we need. We want it to be at the very bottom of the screen, so bottom to the bottom of the parent. That will jump down there. And then for the width, we'll pin the start to the start of the parent, the end to the end of the parent. And because we have layout width 0 dp, because we're saying match the constraints, you can see in the design preview we have the blue outline showing us where our bottom navigation view will go. We're going to need to give it an ID, both to work with in our code, but also to add the constraints to the other view that we're going to need. So let's do ID, and let's simply call this bottom nav for short. It's always good practice to start with your IDs as what the thing is, button, text view, etc. For some of the very long ones, like bottom navigation view, rather than doing this, I think it's acceptable to do bottom nav. This is quite common in code from other developers that I've seen. Okay, so bottom nav, and auto format. So the only other element we're going to need on the screen is a container to swap out our fragments. When we had a quick look at the template, they provided a widget with a lowercase f called fragment like this. We're not going to do it this way in this section. We're taking a more manual approach to this, which would be better for your learning. So instead, rather than a fragment with a lowercase f, we're going to use a simple frame layout with a capital F, frame layout, and we're going to manually put the fragments into this frame layout. So we will use match constraints for both the width and the height. So we'll do 0 dp and 0 dp. We will pin the top to the top of the parent, to the top of the container or the screen. We'll pin the start to the start of the parent, the end to the end of the parent, but the key constraint, the bottom of the frame layout to the top of the bottom nav, and then a self-closing tag. And when I click on this and look to the right, I can see the blue outline showing me that that is filling the remaining space. So the bottom navigation view is there with the blue outline, and our frame layout is there, and that's where our content will go. That's where our app fragments will live. So the last thing we need to do is give this frame layout an ID. So we'll do ID, and we'll call this our frame underscore content. Okay? And believe it or not, that is all that we need to do for this layout. But the fantastic thing is we've managed to achieve it using constraint layout, and this is an absolutely key skill for you, the Android developer. So congratulations. So the next thing we're going to need to be able to get the bottom navigation view working and swap out our fragments is have the actual options in our bottom navigation menu, the running and the cycling, or whatever sports you want to put in your app, okay? So we need to provide these options to our bottom navigation view. And this is actually done using a concept called a menu. Inside the bottom navigation view, if you just make a new line and start typing the word menu with a lowercase m, okay, we can provide a menu in here. And like most things in our XML, it's a resource, it'll be a menu resource file, a bit like colors.xml, a bit like strings.xml or styles or themes.xml, okay? But there's one step that we need to do even before creating our menu, and that is we need to create the icons, the small pictures that will represent the options. The most common pattern for bottom navigation bars is an icon with some short text underneath it. And fortunately for us, rather than going on the internet and finding some icons, which we could do, there's a way that we can add icons right here inside Android Studio, choosing from a fairly decent selection of standard Google material icons. So delete this app menu attribute for now. And if you go ahead on the left and click on Resource Manager, and you can see in our Resource Manager, the only drawables, the only images we have is the background for our app icon and the foreground, which is indeed a small icon. So we want for the sports app an icon that represents the sport. In this project, I'm going to be doing running and cycling. So the way you can do this, click on the plus symbol, and rather than clicking image asset like we did before to bring in pictures, this time we're going to click on vector asset. Before we click on this, a vector is a different type of picture. Rather than being like a PNG or a JPEG or a GIF with lots and lots of data, it's actually a file that looks a little bit like XML that puts coordinates on the page. Vectors, coordinates, so that Android knows how to draw it. And these vectors are used all over the internet, just a sequence of coordinates and colors and instructions for how to draw simple images. So we can create these simple vectors, these simple icons right here, right now. So click on vector asset, and you can see by default we have this clip art selected here, matching our IC launcher foreground that you can see on the left. Okay, so leaving the asset type as clip art, we can choose from some pre-existing clip art icons already bundled in with Android Studio. You could also go online and download an SVG file. That's the format for most vectors online. You could go ahead and find some SVGs, some other vector icons, download them, and then bring them into Android. Android then imports that in a slightly different format, okay? But we're not going to do this. We're going to use the clip art included inside Android Studio. So with clip art selected, double-click the clip art there, and then you can see we have a big, big list of icons that we can use, okay? And if you then in the top left of this icon dialog search, we can type run for running. And I can see I've got a couple of options there, a stickman running and a stickman inside a circle. So I'm going to go ahead and select the one that's not in a circle. I think that'll look a bit better. So I'm going to click this directions run, and I'm going to click OK. So now we have this icon, this vector of a man running. By default, it starts off all of these vector icons with IC for icon, then something that describes what the image is, and then the size in dp. We're going to leave the size as 24 dp. That's a really good size for most icons in Android Studio. I don't recommend changing this to be any smaller or indeed any larger if you're using it as an icon. But we can change the thing in between IC and the size for something descriptive to us. So I'm going to do IC underscore and just call it running underscore 24 for the size, okay? We'll leave the color as black, although later on our bottom navigation view will take care of tinting that to be different colors for when it's selected. So we've chosen some clip art, we've given it a more descriptive name, and then we click next, and we want to leave it in the main folder, so we can just go ahead and click finish. You can see on the left, the resource manager hasn't done a very good job of rendering our preview, but let's go ahead and add another icon for cycling. So plus vector asset, we'll double click the previous one of running. I'm going to type bike, and I can see I've got a few there, but I like the one with a person on the bike, so I will do directions bike, you can see there. Okay, I'll delete this silly baseline directions thing, and I'll just change that to cycling. Directions bike, you can see there. Okay, I'll delete this silly baseline directions thing, and I'll just change that to cycling. So IC for icon underscore cycling underscore the size. Select next, and then finish. So we now have our two icons that we can use. You can use them in image views, you can use them on some buttons, but in the next tutorial we're actually going to build out a menu resource file, and we'll be using them in our menu. If you're curious as to what these vectors actually are, if you go ahead and click on either the cycling or the running one, if you double click it to open the file, you can see it's just some XML. You can see the root element as a vector, it's got some attributes specifying the size, and if I scroll horizontally, there's this very long path, which is a whole sequence of coordinates that tells Android Studio how to draw this, okay? This path data thing isn't anything you ever need to understand. If you want to go ahead and do some further research on what vectors are and how they work, you can do. It's not necessary to have a deep understanding of this, but it is important to know that we can use vectors in Android, and SVG, the standard format of vectors that you find when you download them online, they don't directly work in Android Studio. You would need to import it using the vector asset dialog, select the file, and then what Android Studio will do is it will convert it into this vector XML file, okay? But in short, we can use these vectors for our icons and simple images in our projects, which is absolutely fantastic. So now that we have, go ahead and close any vector files you may have open from the previous tutorial, back to activity underscore main, and change the resource manager back to our project pane. So as mentioned, our bottom navigation view needs a menu resource. We set an attribute called menu, and we give it the name of a file. And by default, it will look for these in a folder called menu inside our resources folder. So on the left, where it says res, and if for any reason you're not in the res folder, click the little target button to jump there straight away. If we look inside this folder, we can see we don't at the moment have any menu folder. So we need to manually create this. So right click on res and click new directory, and simply call it with a lowercase m menu. So now we can right click on this menu folder and click new, and Android Studio is usually quite clever. If you look in the second one down, which is usually our resource file option, it's even calling this a menu resource file. It knows that because we're making this in a menu folder, it's going to be a menu file. So click this, and we can call this anything that will make sense to us. We don't really need to include the word menu, as it's going to be in our menu folder. So I'm simply going to name it by where it's going to show. And this is going to show in our bottom navigation view. So I'm going to simply give it the same name, the same ID, bottom underscore nav. And that'll be accessible from r.menu.bottomnav. So click OK. And for some reason, it insists on giving us this design preview, which doesn't make much sense. I'm going to go purely to the code view. You can see that our top level tag, our top element is a menu tag. So inside this, we can add some menu items. So with a left arrow and a lowercase I for item, autocomplete. And we need to give this three things. An ID, so the code can access it, so the code knows what option's been selected. A title that will be the text, and an icon that will be the picture. So we'll start with an ID, and we'll give this ID. I like to start all navigation IDs with nav underscore, and the name of where we'll be navigating to. So this can be nav underscore running. The title we will give it as simply running, and then the icon, so not src, not source, but icon, we can do ic underscore running, and then autocomplete. And you can see in the left margin next to our line number, we have a little preview of our icon there, the running man. And then simply self-closing tag. We're getting a complaint because we've hard-coded the string running. Let's go ahead and extract this now. So extract string, and we'll just simply call the string running, okay? And we'll do another item for the cycling. So ID, nav underscore cycling, title, cycling, and extract this straight away, save a bit of time later. And then icon, drawable, IC underscore cycling, I can see that there, autocomplete. And that is all we need to do. We have made a menu resource file, and different parts of our app can now use this. So let's jump right back into our activity_main layout and use this menu resource for our bottom navigation view and see what happens when we do. So back in activity_main. Now, in our menu attribute that we started typing, if you type the word menu, you can see we get at menu, and then we have there our one option / bottom nav. And when I auto-complete this, straight away it applies that to our bottom navigation view, even in our design preview. And you can see we have a nice preview there of the two options, including the first option running being selected with our primary color, the default purple. Okay? So if I just open the package for menu, that is a quick introduction to how menu resource files work in Android Studio. They're very straightforward, a bit like our strings, a bit like our colors.xml, okay? And in this menu we can define as many items as we want, with IDs, with titles, with icons, and then we can start to use them in our layouts, use them in our code.